Hey Alaina, welcome to Learning at Large. How are you doing?
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm doing excellent.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about measurement and evaluation, but this time with a bit of a twist because I hear you've written a new book.
I have. It is measurement and evaluation on a shoestring. And before you ask, everybody always asks, what does it mean to be on a shoestring? And the answer is being hyper strategic with the resources that we have so they can go as far and take us the places that we want to go.
Amazing. And just like to give us a quick pitch, if you can, like
Hmm.
what would be a shoestring method, for example, off the top of your head?
So, shoestring means taking into consideration the context that you're in, the challenges you're experiencing, and the goals you have. So, the strategy piece of the equation is thinking up front and
Mhm.
then choosing the best course of action. So, for example, many people contextually have a crap relationship with their stakeholders and they need to get more buy in, more respect, trust, and credibility. And so, sometimes using a return on expectations methodology where you're simply digging into what do stakeholders need and want, and then how can we report back on those needs and wants during the program and after the initiative such that we can be delivering on the thing that matters most to the stakeholder. Now, the trick is sometimes what matters most to our stakeholders isn't what is good learning science or even good measurement methodology. But if we can get quick wins with stakeholders and report back what it is that they need and want, our relationship gets better and everything else gets easier in the long run. So that would be an example of a shoestring strategy that's like, what do I need? And focus on that and follow through with it such that we can get more resources as time goes on.
Okay, yeah, understood. And what made you really focus on shoestring methods this time around?
Well, I have to be honest, the Association of Talent Development saw me speak at a conference. I had done some research and they invited me to write this book. So they have a shoestring series for instructional designers, learning professionals that focuses on, of course, measurement and evaluation, but e-learning, needs assessments, and instructional design principles. So I thought, well, maybe not my first choice for the first book because it's part of a series, but it is my own book. And I have been a shoestring professional my whole career, if you think about it, working for small businesses, working for nonprofits, academia, community based health education. We never have what we need completely. And so being really, really practiced in how do I make the most with what I have and how do I think strategically to get where I want to go, I have probably six or seven different stories throughout the book. So, measurement isn't everybody's favorite cup of tea. And sometimes it's really hard to read a book on measurement. And so I very intentionally wrote the book as though you were sitting down having coffee with me. And so it's a conversational, it's story format. I open every chapter with some hook, some story opening, and then I purposefully leave you hanging so that you'll want to read the chapter and hear how the rest of the story unfolds. And so it's my hope that the book will make measurement more accessible for people. And we'll find out, people will leave reviews on LinkedIn and other places. So we'll find out how it resonates. And I can't wait to hear how people resonate with the book.
Yeah, brilliant. Let's roll back a little bit if we can.
Mhm.
So we know that measurement and evaluation comes up a lot, right, as a key need for learning and development, but often one where there's not always high confidence or a feeling of high skills. Like in your opinion, why do you think it's important for L&D leaders to be carrying out measurement and evaluation? What's your kind of motivation around it?
Well, I want to have the greatest impact. I want to make a difference. I've always felt that way. I mean, I can't remember a time in my life where I didn't want to make a difference. And so if I was working for an organization that wasn't measuring or giving me some kind of goal or target to hit, how would I know if I'm winning? And if I'm a former athlete, so for me, performance really is really important. And I want those goalposts. I want those targets. I want to know what are the expectations for me so that I can hit or exceed them. Because as an individual, I don't want to just meet my goal. I want to surpass it. And
Mhm.
so measurement is that thing. It's the goalposts. It's the guidelines. It's the in the distance you can see that final course that you're running through to get to the finish line. And If we don't have that, it's a lot more difficult for us to feel like we're winning or that we're effective or that we're making a difference. So
Mm.
I can't imagine working for an organization that didn't have that in the fabric of their operations. And when I did work for an organization that didn't have it in the fabric of their operations, I didn't stick around for very long.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So you've given us some examples up front, and hopefully we'll dive into them more of, what shoestring methods or methodology might kind of look like.
Hmm.
In your book, you talk about what's exciting and accessible to use.
Hmm.
So if I'm new to this, like what practical steps could an L&D leader kind of take to initiate measurement efforts, and what would be exciting and accessible maybe to me?
Yeah. So the challenge, I think, for us, and it's multi layered, is we as leaders might want to be data driven. We might want to use measurement and we might want to do a more in depth upfront analysis because the truth of the matter is, without an in depth upfront analysis, measurement isn't possible. So, we need to have some key design principles embedded into our operations. And sometimes the organization itself isn't aligned with that. Stakeholders don't believe that it's worth it to take that extra time, or the organization's not very data driven. So it's hard to follow through with certain best practices when they're not a part of the overall organizational operation. So if you find that you're swimming upstream and that you want to do these things, but the rest of the organization's not on board, I find that many people are in that position. And so the recommendation there is twofold. One, make sure that you're clear on the organization's core metric and then do your part to consistently be aligning your initiatives, programs, and efforts with that core metric. So, for example, well, what do you mean by core metric, Alaina? So, people usually get mixed up between KPIs, key performance indicators. These are the things that we, like dominoes, we knock them over in the hopes that after a few more dominoes knock over, we get to the end and we've accomplished our goal, which would be revenue if you're a for-profit organization or net profit. And if you're a nonprofit organization, it's going to be the core service that you provide for your community or for the world, perhaps. So how much food are you getting out to people? How many people are being served? How many phone calls are you answering out of the number of calls that come in? So there's going to be a core metric that really, really matters to your organization. What is that? And then do a constant evaluation of how are your initiatives, how are you supporting people to align to that core metric. And if there's not a clear commonsensical line of connection, it may be time to reevaluate what you're doing, because that alignment goes a long way to build relationships with stakeholders and to get the organization on board around alignment. Because if everybody is aligned to that core metric and the things that they're doing, now you're having conversations about alignment, which gets you on a similar thread, a similar language that makes everybody more effective. So I think that's one. It's not a learning thing. And in reality, it's not necessarily a measurement thing. It's more of a strategy thing. What's that core metric that matters most for our organization? Are we supporting that or not? And how can we do it better? And be constantly thinking through that. That would be my number one strategy for someone who's like, I want to do better. I'm not really sure where to start. Start with that alignment piece and start having conversations with other departments, with your supervisor, with your team. If you have a global team, how is the whole team thinking about that? And what can we do to improve? And if nobody seems to care about it, this is the part, this is the hard part. If alignment doesn't seem to matter to your team or to the rest of the organization, that might be an indicator that it will be very difficult to measure. And maybe you want to look for other opportunities.
Okay, fair enough. And you mentioned there that the measures and indeed the strategy is not, well, it's not just owned by learning, right? It's not necessarily a learning thing.
Mm-hmm.
So KPIs, for example, often belong to other teams, don't they?
That's right.
So would you always say there's shared ownership over this, and if you can't share it, then as you said, your chances of meeting it are going to be slim.
Yeah. I think there's two pieces to that. One is getting access to those data points and those indicators. And that really requires relationships. And if you don't have a relationship with somebody who has access to that data, well, then we have to dig into, well, why is it that we don't have a relationship or that we don't have access to the data?
Mm.
Usually it's because we lack a strategy and a compelling reason why we need access to that data. So if I present a hypothesis, which I talk about in the first chapter of my book, think like a researcher, hypothesize everything and say, hey, I have this hypothesis that if people participate in this and complete this leadership program, it's going to build this knowledge, skills, and attitudes area, which will then help people improve this specific type of performance. I believe that that's going to help us with retention of this team. I need the data that helps me see what retention looks like historically and what retention will look like during and after the program. Can you help me get access to this data so I can test my hypothesis? That's a very different conversation than just asking for access to retention data. Without a compelling reason why, some of those data gatekeepers might not care to give us access because they have to do extra work or change permissions or clean the data or something. So, giving a compelling reason to get access to the data is really important. Um, and I feel like there was another piece to that question, and I totally forgot where I was going to go with that.
That's right. I was talking about being joined up with other people in the business to,
Mhm.
to share those goals. And I think
Yeah.
what you talked about there and using the hypothesis framework, which
Mhm.
is, as you say, at the beginning of your book,
Yeah.
is you've given a great example there for a leadership project.
Mhm.
Um, I guess like with the example you just gave, which was
Mhm.
about in the end, for example, boosting retention,
Yeah.
you'd hope if your strategy was aligned in the first place that you would
Mhm.
hear that request coming in the first place, right? We
Right.
need to boost retention, so therefore we need some help with our performance, and therefore we need some help with our learning. But
Mhm.
I guess you're accepting the fact that that sometimes doesn't happen.
Mm.
Sometimes it comes in, unfortunately, at that kind of order level of we need some learning on, and it could feel quite far removed at that point on
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
For example, without that kind of connection. So your
Mhm.
hypothesis framework, I think, helps you build back up to
That's
those
right.
key goals. Would you say?
That's right. Yeah. So I mentioned at the beginning of this recording that I have this insight I took away from the Learning Leaders Conference, which was in Orlando just a couple of weeks ago, and um, I I've always known that there was a really deep rooted reason why measurement was so hard, and articulating that is sometimes challenging. And I heard from a few people for the very first time language that I think answers the why is it so difficult for us to measure and do the best practices that we know are going to lead us to success, like an upfront analysis. The language is people give us a solution. And I'd never thought about that before. I know we talk about the order taker thing, but when you frame it in the language of someone is giving us a solution. So, therefore, there are a ton of assumptions that we should unpack, but maybe we don't because we assume that the solution is accurate, that they've done the upfront analysis. And in reality, none of that usually happens at the depth or the breadth that it should. And so we take a solution that we assume is a solution and then we go design for it. I think that's the thing that we have to change in the industry is anytime somebody comes to us with a solution and asks us to go deliver that solution, we need to get creative and critical and empathetic because without empathy, this is really difficult. But to change the conversation from taking the order to digging into what's the performance that we want to see changed. And that small pivot away from taking the order into let's validate that this is the solution and let's validate and explore what the problem is to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Well, all of those conversations equal data points that can help us to measure in the long term. Um, so, yeah, it's that I'm given a solution. And if I don't have the experience or the confidence to facilitate a conversation to dig into, is this really the solution?
Mm.
I think people who are new, people who are accidentally in our industry, that is probably going to be very hard to pivot that conversation away from just delivering the solution versus questioning it in the first
Yeah.
place.
And
Mhm.
there are a lot of new people, like with different experience. They're not necessarily learning people coming into the learning space, and so yeah, that's a good one to pick up on. I also think as we move towards skill-based
Mhm.
learning, skill gap, um, kind of a need to fill the skill,
Mhm.
then there's a risk that people will then articulate the need in terms of we need this skill,
Mhm.
and that doesn't mean that you go away and just go produce the learning, right? You still need to
Right.
ask all those questions that you've
That's
always
right.
asked.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's an opportunity there to kind of get it right and change the conversation, but
Mhm.
equally, like, the threat is there to fall back into bad practice,
Mhm.
I think.
That's right. And something else that came up over the last couple of months, I've been on the road at different conferences all year. And
Mhm,
so another thing that I thought really interesting was the definition of capabilities. So I think we use these terms interchangeably: skill development, capabilities, competencies, and we kind of think in the end they're the same thing. And I heard a definition of capability that I thought was brilliant because it unpacks, well, what do we need to be capable? And so the definition included, if we have capability, then we are able to drive an organizational outcome. And a capability is a combination of skills, knowledge, policies, the right tools, and the motivation or the right attitude. And so to me, when I was trained and I got my master's and doctorate in education, we only focused on knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And that made sense in the
mhm,
context of the Industrial Revolution style education, which we hear all the time. But the reality is, in the workplace, now, if you're in higher ed or K 12, KSA is sufficient. But if you're in the workplace, I believe we need to lean away from skills and into capabilities because it's inclusive of, I think, the few things that are often missing, like good policies or criteria and tools. If our
mhm,
environment's not set us up for success, then it doesn't matter how skilled we are. We're not going to be able to perform correctly. So, as a measurement professional, when I heard this definition, of course, my first question was, how do we measure capabilities? And because it's complex skills, you can do tests, you can do scenarios, you can do role plays, and we can evaluate how skilled somebody might be. But capabilities look at policies, procedures,
mhm.
tools, and people's ability to use them to then roll up to some outcome that we seek in the organization. So I would hope that our industry would move away from skills because they are fleeting.
Mm,
They're usually temporary, not always, but a capability, because it's built on an interweaving of a few different things. I feel like capabilities will last longer and be more useful than skills. And from a measurement perspective, do we measure skills or should we measure capabilities? I would want to be measuring capabilities for the benefit of the organization as a whole.
I guess, like, there's quite a big uphill climb there to maybe help now change the language around skills, right? Because everyone's seems to have got hooked onto it as the new
Mhm.
thing. But yeah, the application and the context and the tools, as you say, that sits around it, the kind of framework
That's right.
that you've described that kind of comes with the idea of capability.
Hmm.
Even evaluating that in the beginning would help you show people talk about skills gaps, right? But the
Hmm.
application gaps, like
Hmm.
the tool gaps that are
Hmm.
around it,
That's
it
right.
would help frame that, wouldn't it, from the very off?
That's right. And if we had this, you hear that some organizations are doing a periodic skills assessment. What
Mhm,
skills do we have? What do we need? I feel like let's up it a little bit because skills don't invite you to look at the environment and how well it's enabling the skills that we want people to be using. I once heard um, a gentleman who wanted to start a whole business. And I won't say any names, but I think it was a fascinating idea. He wanted to start a whole business building an environmental assessment so that people would take this assessment before designing and delivering learning to be able to see, are people going to be successful because the environment is set up for success. Because in the end, when we think about measurement, we often think about, let's evaluate the program at the end and see what it did for the organization or for people. I think a better way of using measurement as a concept or as a practice is to, before we invest in any initiative, we measure a few things to see, is it really going to be successful? Because there are a few things we can look at and investigate up front, like the alignment piece, back to the
Mhm.
core metric conversation. Is this initiative aligned to the organization's core metric in a logical way? Like, can you make a loose hypothesis pretty clearly about the relationship between this program and this core metric? If that's difficult, probably it's not worth investing in. The other thing would be, is your environment set up in the right ways? Do we have the policies in place, and does everybody understand them? Can they access them to be able to perform? Do we have the tools? Do we have the support we need from managers to go do this new or refined thing? If those things aren't in place, we're not going to be successful. It's not worth investing in the initiative. So I'm thinking, let's not measure in the traditional do a study after the program is over. No, let's measure up front. Does this have a chance of being successful? And then let's go invest in it. Otherwise, it's not worth it.
So kind of like expanding out that needs analysis stage to actually
Mhm.
go a bit deeper, and I think often data is the answers to the questions you've asked of stakeholders and hopefully users, but actually going a little bit deeper with that at the
Mhm.
beginning, seeing
Mhm.
what barriers are there.
That's right. Investigating barriers. That's a great way of putting it very succinctly. If there are too many barriers, we should go back to stakeholders and say, hey, here's what we've discovered. How do you want
Mhm.
to navigate this so that we can be more successful? And if we don't have those conversations, we're going to waste time and money. And then in the end, who gets blamed for it? Oh, that training didn't work.
Yeah, probably because it wasn't a training problem.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, nice. I'm going to bring us back to putting a kind of learning manager's hat on
Hmm.
and see if we can give them some more examples
Hmm.
and helpful ideas, which I think many of which are in your book and also your previous books, about like where they might be able to kind of borrow data, some simple metrics they might be able to use. Like, does it help to frame it with an example? You mentioned you have stories in your book. I don't know whether
Yeah.
that's something to call out.
Yeah. So the idea of borrowing is fascinating when it comes to data. So imagine the world that we live in. Like, let's take it out of the workplace for a moment. We have smartwatches, we have smart rings now, we have Alexas and Google Voice and Google Home, and we have Siri. And then we have all of the tools that we use, our Google Calendar or Outlook calendars, all these different tools that are helping us to manage our lives, our GPS system before we had it on our phones. So we are swimming in data, just absolutely swimming in data. And so now, if we take it into the workplace, just take a moment and imagine, where are all the data artifacts that exist that help us to see what's happening in the organization. We have calendars that help people to track meetings and the frequency of those meetings and who's meeting with what. We have all, like, if you're at a call center, we have all the recordings of those conversations. If you are working in a retail, you have, in some cases, you have all of this data on the footsteps, and like there can be an infinite amount of data on what is happening in the workplace, whatever that workplace is for you. So I invite us to think about the artifacts that are already accessible that we can just tap into to help us make smarter choices about how can we develop people and what do people need to get to the organizational's core metrics.
Mhm.
And so sometimes we automatically think about measurement. We think like we have to create an assessment, or we have to buy an assessment, or we have to write survey questions. And I invite you to stop for a moment and ask, what data could I borrow, as in tap into, that's already existence, that can help us to evaluate similarly? And therefore, we don't have to create assessments, or, oh my gosh, who likes to write assessment questions? I mean, I do, but most people don't. So, and we're not really that great at it. So I think, instead of thinking I have to create my own data, think about, what data can I tap into that will help me evaluate, is growth and change happening in the way that we need it to, relative to the goals of our initiative. And I think that can open up a lot of, well, you build relationships to get access to that data, and then it becomes easier. And it saves you time from having to collect and analyze that data when it's probably already being collected and analyzed already.
Yeah. Okay. So I was thinking back to the example you gave earlier, which was you're talking about leadership as a quick example that
Mhm,
you kind of pulled out of a hat. It's a common area for L&D to focus on,
mhm,
and you kind of connected it up with retention, for example.
mhm,
That could be one of the metrics that you could look at. It could be employee engagement, which is connected to that but different, for
mhm,
example.
mhm,
Like retention, I guess there's going to be loads of data, right, on who's leaving, at what point they leave. Like,
mhm. Why are they
maybe,
leaving? What are they saying in their exit surveys? Mhm,
yeah, did they or didn't they access learning before they left?
mhm.
Was,
How many
did it make
times
a
did they
difference?
meet with their manager? Yeah, what did they say in employee engagement surveys? I think we can unpack what is happening around retention by just thinking for a moment, where are all the data points that help us to understand the story and the experience of the people who leave? Are they
Mhm,
something as simple I write in the book about onboarding. It's another area where we suck at measuring onboarding, yet we do it and we spend a lot of time
mhm,
investing in onboarding. We know it's necessary. However, how do we measure if onboarding is helpful? One thing is, well, what do you want to happen because somebody has gone through an onboarding? And I hear a lot of times that, especially in the remote working environment, we want people to feel connected as quickly as possible to their peers, to their leaders. And so, how do
mhm,
we facilitate that sense of connection and belonging? Well, if maybe one of the calls to action is that you invite people to your virtual or in person sort of like new employee happy hour, how many people go to that? The new people and the tenured people. And our people just we say that we want to create connection, but then nobody shows up. So those kinds of like looking at attendance and those things that we want people to be doing, ice cream socials back in the day, we used to
mhm,
have happy hours and lunches. There's all kinds of things that we used to do that were designed to facilitate connection. Do people actually show up to that stuff? Or are we just encouraging and then nobody comes and it's sort of this values that aren't actually being lived out? So I invite us to think about what would be the indicator that connection exists or that people are interacting with one another. What are the ways that that might show up in the real world? And let's go track those things. And the data is already there. So it's just a matter of thinking more creatively about data artifacts and thinking less about how do I collect the data because it's not going to be usually as useful as what maybe is already around us.
mm. I guess what's interesting about onboarding from my experience, I don't know about yours, but you sometimes get the a double goal is even a very simple way to put it. You
Mhm,
get the one that you mentioned, which is about the feeling, the
mhm,
sentiment. Like, do
mhm,
I feel like I'm connected? Do I feel like
mhm,
I'm part of this company? Do I feel
mhm,
respected? That kind of stuff.
mhm,
And then you have the need to, we must get them productive
mhm,
by week 8, or week 6 or week
mhm.
4, whatever it is, sometimes within a week.
Yeah.
So you get the dual goal. So like productivity, there's a whole host of things that means, right? And loads of
Mhm,
data points on that depending on their role.
mhm.
So I think, like, do you find like if you get that kind of double crossover, that might sometimes block people from even thinking about how to measure it, whereas actually you need to pull it apart and think about the different data sources?
Yeah, we can have multiple hypotheses for what we're doing and why for any initiative. And yes, we should pull them apart because if we aren't moving the needle, if people aren't being productive, and importantly, if they're not being productive in the time we hope that they would, and they're not feeling connected or a sense of belonging in the organization, well, those are insights that we can go take action on to improve. Because in the end, if people don't feel connected and they're not being productive, those are two indicators that they are not going to stick around. So
Mm,
if we can see in advance that people are feeling connected or they're doing the things that would help them to create connection, if no one's showing up to for example, the new employee meet and greet that they have once a month, if the tenured folks are too busy and the new folks come and nobody's there, well, how is that supposed to create a sense of connection? So we want to see these indicators showing up and someone's got to track them. And
mhm,
the benefit is a lot of times our senior leaders, the people who sit in that C suite, they don't have the data and the insights around what's happening at these different levels of the organization. So if learning can have a pulse on some of these things that are happening, hey, people
mm,
aren't showing up to these connection things and they're saying they don't feel like they belong or they connect. I think we can do things a little bit differently. Can we have a conversation about that? I think that might be part of the reason why people leave in less than a year. C-suite people will listen to that because it's data, it's insights that they didn't have access to. And maybe they do something about it and maybe they don't. But I do believe that doing our due diligence and reporting the things that we can uniquely observe adds a lot
Mm.
of value to the organization. And that's a way of preserving and protecting our jobs.
I like the way, like, 'cause the examples you've been given, which are fairly broad for the kinds of data you could be looking at, um, for me is because I think some people go looking for the bit of data that's going to help them know that their learning intervention has worked, rather than looking, which is important, I'm not saying it's not, but rather than looking more broadly at the data that gives you the sense of the picture, like what might be
Mhm.
going on,
Mhm.
and just taking away for a moment, trying to find that magic metric which
Mhm.
helps you connect up your learning with what's happening.
Mhm.
I wonder if that kind of, because sometimes when people think about data points, they think, well, that's out of our control or that's not to do with the learning. So I will ignore those and look for
Mhm.
one single magic metric.
Mhm. Yeah.
Do you think that happens sometimes?
Yes. And in the very end of the book, there's this part that says bringing it all together. And I say something like, if you came to this book looking for almost literally your words, a magic metric or a magic methodology that you can use every time to be able to test and prove the effectiveness of your program, I don't I don't have that for you. I'm
Mhm.
sorry if you're disappointed, but even on a shoestring, even with limited resources and time, there is never going to be a magic metric that we can use every time. That oversimplification is what gets us in trouble because then we don't see the whole picture. And I think that's the problem with the way that we measure is that most people are looking at completion rates and satisfaction. Maybe some sophisticated people are looking at knowledge, skills, and performance, but we need that whole picture. Learning I mean, I hear people are in silos, but I think we contribute to those silos. And to you, the point you mentioned earlier about we are really an interdisciplinary or interdepartmental team as an organization that is all really working together. Even if we're working separately, we're working together to create some kind of outcome or drive some sort of metric for the organization. And so the silos really hold us back. And in many ways, when we only look to the data and our learning experience platform to help us make sense of how learning is influencing outcomes in the organization, we're looking at the wrong things because that doesn't, completion of learning doesn't guarantee. We all know transfer and the learning transfer evaluation model and the transfer effectiveness institute. There's whole studies and best practices around transferring and getting people to apply learning. If we're not looking into the ecosystem of what it takes to make transfer happen and we're not
Mm.
thinking about that in the upfront analysis, it's going to be really difficult for us to win over stakeholders and to prove that what we did made a difference. And
Yeah.
I feel a little guilty in the sense that I wish I could give a magic metric. It's just not possible. If we want to be effective, we have to consider the whole ecosystem of how we're doing what we're doing and why. And that is strategy at its finest. You know,
Yeah.
the other thing I say in the book that I think is a problem for our industry is that we jump into tactics without a strategy. And I think this is a great example of, well, just give me one metric I can use to track success. That's very, very tactical. And if you go employ tactics without a strategy that really is the glue that holds your tactics together and makes them make sense, we could end up with data that's totally useless. And the consequence of that is our C suite, the people who sign our paychecks, look at us and say, those people aren't credible. They don't know what they're doing. I would never want to put anybody in that position. So a lot of times, oversimplification can
Mm.
be a real danger with horrible consequences for our careers. So simplifying things, this is the other thing I hear that is devastating, I think, to the industry, is that we want to track the rates of completion alongside those big important metrics like retention. And if we only track the trends in completion of training and the trends of retention for a certain target audience and we see, oh, they're both going up, and we take credit that training is the thing that led to the increases in retention, or conversely, if we see people if we see they are completing training and retention's going down, you could make the argument that training was the thing that led to poor retention. So be careful with your oversimplification, because that can get us in trouble with the C-suite, because people look at these data points in depth and they ask questions, and
Mm,
we're missing too much. We're missing the performance and the capability pieces of the equation. So do not oversimplify, because again, our jobs could be on the line and so could our credibility.
mm. So I guess it's like being specific, being ultra specific about like what helps you show that story is
Hmm.
happening, that performance
Hmm.
story or capability story we talked about
Hmm.
earlier.
Yeah.
But you can simplify it for yourself,
Hmm.
perhaps by looking at like what data already exists, like you were
That's
saying,
right.
and borrowing,
That's right.
but don't oversimplify the problem or just look for the magic data.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's sort of strange, because you think a book written for the shoestring professional would, I mean, there are some simple wins like return on expectations, or even just building the practice of aligning your learning to that core metric, like building that habit of thinking in that way. It is a small thing to do. And then when you see things aren't aligned, it's an indicator. Let's start questioning if this still makes sense, as is it a worthy use of our time and resources to be investing in this? Because here's the opportunity. When we invest in the things that matter more and we let go of the things that aren't having the impact, well, we can use more time to do better learning science, and we can do better measurement methodologies. When we're investing in less initiatives, we can do them well and right. But if we're focused too much on the new and now, as the leaders of the 5 moments of need say, we get so caught up in the new and now and pushing out new content that we don't know if we're being effective, but we don't have
Mm.
the time to stop and pause and say, is this the right thing to be investing in? If we just said no to more things and did the things that we do invest in really, really well, what a difference that could make.
And you could bring your stakeholders with you so much more, right, as well, with that additional time you'd have, like,
That's
make it
right.
a joined up journey. I
Mm-hmm.
was about to ask you about, like, what happens when, it's a kind of question that learning managers ask is, "I've got multiple projects, I've got multiple priorities, like, I can't possibly do measurement and evaluation for them all, so
Mm-hmm.
what do I do in that situation?"
Mm-hmm.
Like, I guess one of your answers there was, like, just prioritize what you're focusing on in the first place, like, but are there any other tips that you can think of for people who are in those big organizations just
Mm-hmm.
juggling all the time?
Yeah. Two things. It makes it easy if you have your core metric and you've gotten alignment around that. So anytime somebody brings in a request for training, and then you say, okay, let's talk through how this helps us to influence our core metric. And like, let's just talk through loosely and create a hypothesis, which has certain variables. We have the program itself or the initiative. It doesn't have to be a program. We have how are we develop people's capabilities? What's the key performance indicator that is supposed to influence? Maybe there's more than one. And how does that relate to the organization's core metric? We can unpack that in less than 10 minutes in a conversation. If that doesn't make sense, or someone isn't clear on how we're going to make that relationship, your training requester, it's not a good use of our resources.
Mhm,
So that's one thing, is to just build the practice of doing an upfront alignment test. Let's just map this out. Let's see if it makes sense. And if it loosely makes sense, okay, now we can move forward to the next stage of a little bit more analysis and design thinking and metrics, etc.
brilliant.
Um, yeah. And then the other thing is the
Mhm,
back of the napkin math. This one is such a winner, and it's a little confrontational, but I think it's important that we build the habit of using our back of the napkin math when we have a sense that this isn't a good investment, or there's not enough insight, like when you're given a solution already without validating if it's a solution. Do some back of the napkin math really quickly. You can say, okay, you want me to train 100 people. This program will probably be an hour for 100 people, and it'll take our team about 40 hours to develop it. There's a cost associated with every one of those things. 100 people for an hour, the salary average, let's say, that could be, I don't know, $100,000 potentially, depending on the people's salaries. Maybe it's 50,000 or 10,000. So people taking the time to invest in the initiative, our team's time building the resources and facilitating it. What's the number on that? And then to ask the question, does it make sense, or are you comfortable investing in an initiative, this dollar amount loosely, if we don't know that it's going to move the needle. The other thing to add to that would be, well, what's the problem costing the organization?
Yeah.
And if it persists and we do nothing, if we absolutely do no intervention and it costs the business, let's say $5,000 a month, and then the intervention costs the organization $50,000, if it doesn't work, we've just made it worse, because now we have the cost of $5,000 a month and the investment of $50,000. Now we've just costed the organization so much more. So I think there is some loose math that we could do and incorporate that into conversation with people who are requesting training and say, is this a worthy investment? And sometimes if the solution is more expensive than the problem, maybe we just let the problem persist.
Yeah. Unless you can see it's going to become a really big one, like in a few
Right.
years' time,
That's right.
in which case there's probably some data around it,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. And maybe we can get really tiny napkins as well. So you
Yeah.
can't fit,
Yeah. I mean,
math is
this would be kind of funny. If I go speak at conferences, I should give away a back of the napkin math, like note cards or something, and be like, okay, this is your reminder to put this on your desk. And anytime somebody requests training, there's a few things: how many people, the average salary, how much time, how much is your team's time, what's the number on that, how does that relate to how much this is costing the business, does it make sense to invest?
There you go, marketing solutions sorted for future conferences. No, I think that's a great idea. But like
You heard it here first.
yeah, but re-listening, that's also really helpful. So I hope everybody has just jotted that down, and if
Mhm.
not, we'll make that available anyway on our website. So I'm going to switch to some final fun questions that we like to ask on our podcast.
Yes, please.
One is, what L&D practice would you happily put in the bin forever? Have you got any thoughts on that one?
Mm. What would I put in the bin forever? Man, if I could put administration, and it's hard to say that because measurement requires a lot of administration, but the measurement piece of things is usually a little bespoke because, like we mentioned, there's not a one size fits all approach to measuring every initiative. So there's a little bit of creativity, which I'd rather spend my time doing the creative putting together of our measurement systems and our strategy, rather than things like sending reminder emails and checking attendance and like the little logistical things that we do need the data. So if I hired an AI agent that would take all that away from me so that I could free myself up to do the more creative critical work, that would be admin stuff, trying to offload all of it altogether. So it's not putting it in the bin exactly, it's just delegating it really intentionally.
Nice. I like the way you switched your bin to be like some kind of servant for you. So that's nice. I like the idea. Okay, another one then to think about
Mhm.
is you're stuck on a desert island. It's a nice one though, so
There's water, right?
there's water
Let me bring
and
it.
some nice warm but not too hot,
Okay.
nice beaches. Anyway, if you can take one L&D practice that would keep you sane and productive,
Mm.
a book about learning design or something in that area.
Hmm.
Maybe you can take a person with you, someone who's inspired you. Who would you take on the island with you? Or who and what, I guess, is the question.
Well, how long am I gonna be there?
Let's not make it too long. Okay, let's say you've got at least 12 weeks on this island. It's a very L&D island.
Okay. Well, let me say this, I wouldn't take a person. I'm not sure I could handle 12 weeks with any one person, even my mother, who I adore. Um, I'm glad she doesn't listen to my podcasts. I think I would bring like a Kindle because I would want to be able to revisit. Like, I love deep thinking time. In fact, I take 6 weeks off every year to reflect on my year, look at my own numbers and metrics, and look at how can I optimize and refine. So if I was stuck on a desert island, it would be the perfect time to think, which means I don't want anyone distracting me. And I would want to have like a handful of resources that touch all the things that matter to me. So some of those resources would be marketing. How do I improve my marketing initiatives? Some of them would be learning science and the geeky stuff. Like, what are people who have written books on measurement and learning science I haven't read or I'd like to reread? And then I would make a playbook for what I would optimize once I got back home to the non-beachy, not so perfect weather of wherever I am.
Nice, I like it. And meanwhile, your administrator bin can be sorting out loads of stuff for you back on the mainland.
That's right. That's right.
Nice. Thank you. So that brings us a close to the podcast today, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us, and so many tips I think that people can take away from this one. So yeah, massive thank you to you.
Yeah, well, and if anyone is interested in getting a preview of the book or potentially purchasing it, you can find that at dralaina.com/book. You'll get it all there.
Fantastic. Thank you. And you're also on LinkedIn, so we
That's
can
right. I'm all over LinkedIn. You can find me easily there too. Thanks for that reminder.
That's all right. We'll put the links on our podcast write up anyway on our website, so everybody can find you and the book.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.